Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I will introduce myself. My name is Janelle Maxwell, and I'm the project coordinator for the CWCF's Justice, Equity, Diversity, Decolonization, and Inclusion Business Conversion Project, which we sometimes abbreviate JEDDI for short. And this project is essentially a project that seeks to raise awareness of the cooperative and social purpose organization models, as well as facilitate conversions from traditional businesses to cooperatives and other types of social purpose organizations. And it is funded by the Government of Canada's Investment Readiness Program. And we do have a focus on members of equity denied groups throughout this project, as we notice that there is a lack of engagement from marginalized groups within the cooperative and social finance sector at large. And I also wanted to point out Hazel Corcoran, the CWCS Executive Director that's here today. If you could just use the hand function so folks know who you are, as well as Kay Grant, who is the Operations and Member Services Manager. She'll be helping us with some tech today. So if you could just wave or again, use the hand function so everyone knows who you are, that will be great. And as well, I'm going to ask everyone to please hold their comments and questions until the Q&A session at the end. And if you could keep yourself muted if you're not speaking, that would be amazing as well. So just some housekeeping items. So here's a very, very brief overview of what we'll be discussing today. I'm not going to go too in depth, as each presenter sort of has their own debrief on what they'll be talking about. And we do want to let everyone know that we do have simultaneous translation captions enabled for this webinar today. So if you're more comfortable understanding in a language other than English, you can just head to those 3 dots above more and then select captions, and then just make sure that that translation knob is enabled, and then you'll be able to choose the language that your captions show up in. So for example, if you're Francophone, you would choose French. There's 2 options, French Canada and French France. If French Canada isn't enabled or isn't working, just try French France and that should work. All right, so I'm now going to ask Hazel if you could please put the link to the Zoom polls in the chat. So we just have 2 quick questions that we're hoping everyone can answer to just help us get a better feel of who is in the room today. In the meanwhile, I will introduce our first presenter, who is Russ Christensen. Russ Christensen has been working with communities, cooperatives, enterprises, unions, environmental organizations, and private businesses to meet their strategic goals and develop good governance practices. He has helped launch over 200 cooperatives with a 70% success rate, for which he gives the founders credit. As a volunteer in his own community of Campbellford, Ontario, Russ was the founding president of the Aaron Theatre Cooperative and the Campbellford Seymour Community Foundation. Welcome, Russ. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Janelle, and welcome everybody. Great to see that we've got good attendance today. So yeah, you can just go ahead and forward to my slides. That'd be great. It's really a pleasure to talk about this co-op conversion piece because there's so many opportunities, and obviously the businesses that are owned by baby boomers and others are nearing retirement. So there's going to be a lot of asset transfer. So it's how to, but before we answer how, I'd like to sort of think about why. Like, why are we doing this? So one thing is that only about 14% of the retiring small and medium-sized enterprise owners have a solid retirement plan. So that's a big reason, and I just mentioned that earlier. In many cases, the businesses that are converting to co-ops, assuming that they are viable businesses or going concerns, they're important to keep the jobs and the services and those assets in whichever geographic community they're operating in. So that's often a big motivation. It also helps address inequality and equity because co-ops are democratic organizations. So you'll be hearing today about, other kinds of conversions, but I think co-ops are a great one because of the democratic aspect of the economy. And if you look at our current situation globally and in our own country, inequality is growing quickly. There's lots of equity issues. There's precarious employment. So I think the democratic aspect's important. Providing fair compensation for the employees and also providing a legacy for the current owner. And also, when an owner is purchased, is bought out from their business, making sure that they get fair compensation for that too. Often owners that are selling have inflated expectation about what their business might be worth. So it's a whole negotiation process that needs to happen. And then I think it's important for every business now to have a triple bottom line. So this is an opportunity, if that hasn't been introduced to a small business, to introduce it. You can go to the next slide. So these are a couple quotes from Project Equity is a co-op conversion project in the United States. It's doing really well. There's all kinds of co-ops that are becoming from converted private businesses. So I'm not going to read you the quote. You can read that yourself, and you can go to the next slide. Here's another worker owner of a bakery. So you can see the whole idea of collaboration and cooperation and bringing that into the economy is one of the key aspects of the cooperative model. Next slide. This is a photograph of the Aaron Theatre Cooperative. We showed Brotherhood, which is a Canadian film, to the high schools in our high school students in our town. So there's a community asset supporting Canadian films and our high school students. So that was great. Keep going. All right, so cooperative and social purpose organization or enterprise model. I think it's important to realize that for co-ops, they have twice the success rate of regular businesses. So about 80% of small businesses fail within the first 5 to 6 years. So co-ops have a twice the success rate, so that's good. Working together, people can pool their resources and knowledge with the employees or community and the employer, the person who's selling the business, working together. It really helps out with the transition through information sharing. Also, the costs are shared in terms of the transition. And then I've already mentioned that co-ops are a proven democratic legal model. There's lots of co-ops all over the world, and they've been around for hundreds of years. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So there was a project that was operated through the University of Toronto called Co-op Convert. They did a lot of research over the last 3 or 4 years, and they looked at the small business enterprises and the owners and co-op conversions across Canada. And this is some of the main considerations that owners have regarding succession planning. And I'm not going to read all those. You can look at those. And I just think the important thing is to realize that there's a lot of considerations when an owner's selling their business, and succession planning should really be a 3 to 5 year process. It's not something that just happens in a few weeks. And part of the thing that isn't, a lot of people focus on the financial aspects and the value of the business, but the emotional aspects of letting go of business are really important. So I think it's important for people to understand that this whole negotiation process is quite complex because, you know, it involves human beings. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so from my experience, there's some necessary conditions to even consider a conversion from an existing business to a cooperative or to a social purpose organization. So clearly the current owner's got to be supportive of the idea. If they're not, then that's pretty well a no-go. There's got to be a sufficient number of employees or community members or a combination of the two that want to buy the business. If the employees aren't interested, obviously it's not going to move forward. Number 3, the business really should be a going concern. I mentioned that earlier. Or there needs to be a strong turnaround strategy with good prospects for future cash flow. There's no point trying to take a failed business and convert it to a cooperative. The organization structure is not going to save it. It's got to be a good business. So number 4, that the current owner and the potential buyers have a good relationship and they have open communication. They're sharing information. They see things as a win-win negotiation. There's a high level of trust that's existing between them. That makes a huge difference in the negotiations because this takes time. And number 5, I mentioned this, the importance of people having that frame of mind around the negotiations, that it's not a zero-sum game, it's a win-win situation. And that really encourages creative solutions and sharing information really openly. Okay, can go to the next slide. So Co-op Convert, there's their website. They have great case studies. They've got research reports. There's all kinds of resources they have available. I really recommend that you check it out if you're interested in this work. And CWCF has a good area with conversions too, to worker co-ops particularly. So I'm not going to read these items on the slide, but I just think it's interesting to know. And it's like I said before, it sort of reinforces the 5 conditions, the 5 necessary conditions that I said you need. So this research from Co-op Convert is confirming that. Next slide. So people are probably wondering, like, how many co-op conversions actually happen? So this is research again from Co-op Convert, and you can see that the sample is about 400 co-op conversions in almost every different industry you can think of. I think generally service industries tend to have more potential because there isn't a huge capitalization barrier. If it's a high capital organization or business, then it may be more challenging to raise the capital. So this is from March 31st, 2023. This is pretty recent research. And you can see this on Co-op Convert's website. Okay, next slide. So I just put a bunch of logos on this page just to show you all the different organizations that have converted to co-op or a social purpose organization. And a number of these are worker cooperatives, but there's also funeral cooperatives. There's a forestry co-op, ambulance co-op, the air and theater co-op. So there's all kinds of different industries represented and different kinds of co-ops. Some are workers, some are multi-stakeholder, and some are community based or consumer co-ops. And some are not for profit and some are for profit. Okay, next slide. So these next few slides are really going to just go through the 18 steps that we've identified over the years. And then there's sort of 4 go, no-go decision-making points in the process. So this is really the how-to. So number 1, you need to make the seller aware of what the options are. So all the options, and Jennifer is going to go through a number of options later in her presentation. So that's going to be a really good overview. Number 2, you really need to get all the financial information, all the legal information. So the seller's got to be willing to share all the information that they have, including what they have in their head. So you do need to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that the owner feels comfortable generally. And that's an important step. And getting them to cooperate and share that information up front in the beginning of the process, and then learning to do that over time is great. And it's part of that emotional letting go for an owner. Number 3, so assessing the risk of transferring the business. This is a big deal. And I would include, you know, the feasibility assessment, like what the market looks like, the cash flow forecast, what an initial net asset might look like on the balance sheet for the value of the business. There's a sustainability scorecard that we use that has lots of different metrics, and it's a triple bottom line. And I don't know if people have heard of the Flourishing Business Canvas, but it's a business canvas that provides a great overview from a triple bottom line point of view. So we've been using that too. And what it does is it helps identify and educate the employees and the seller regarding the triple bottom line for their business and potentially the transfer, and how that can increase the value of the business over time as well. Okay, next slide. So at the end of those 3 steps, there's a go, no-go decision-making point. So the next 4 steps. So you want to work together with the seller to develop a transfer plan, like how much time, how many years are they thinking? Do they want to continue on working with the business? Sometimes sellers do, or do they want to leave the business? What kind of agreements need to be made around that? So the timing's important, what their expectations are, making sure that you manage those expectations. Then with the purchasing group, it's important to set up a steering committee. So again, you can use the sustainability scorecard and the flourishing business canvas to help educate the members about the business. Sometimes employees, don't know how to read financial statements. They've never been taught. So that financial literacy piece is important. So helping them understand what financial ratios are and what a balance sheet and an income statement and what cash flow means. So all those kinds of things are going to be part of the process. And then if things are still looking good, the feasibility is looking good, expectations are being managed, you can sign a commitment letter. So that's not, actually a purchase agreement. It's just a commitment letter to continue to work together, the seller and the steering committee. And if they're not willing to sign that letter, I wouldn't continue. So there's another go, no-go decision-making point. Next slide, please. Okay, so step 8, the steering committee needs to develop a business takeover plan and identify all the different models, elements in the business canvas and the scorecard targets, the financial aspects of the business, looking at the future cash flow and the net present value of that, which is looking then at the business valuation. You can make these calculations yourself in terms of business valuation, or if the parties want to get an external professional business valuator, they exist. They have an association in Canada, and it'll cost you, a couple $1,000s probably to do that business valuation, but you do get a third party outside point of view, which can be quite helpful, especially in managing the expectations of the price that the seller thinks they can get for their business. I mentioned earlier that's sometimes inflated. You want to train the steering committee because they're probably going to become a board of directors if the transfer does happen. So you can start training them around board of directors, governance training, and cooperatives or social purpose organizations and how they're different from regular businesses. So there's lots of education and adult education that needs to go on. And then once the parties do agree on a business valuation, which is a huge hurdle, then you can finalize the organizational structure. You can incorporate whether it's a cooperative or not-for-profit organization or some other kind of organizational structure as a social purpose organization, and then develop the bylaws for that organization, which are the rules of governing. Okay, the next slide. So the 12th step, the steering committee together, hopefully with the seller, will develop a business plan and a financing plan. And then it sounds easy, raising the required capital, but that can be quite a challenge. Jennifer is going to show some different ways you can do that. But I think if the business plan is strong and there's lots of support in the community, the employees have a good opportunity, the seller's patient, I think you can raise the capital if it's a good idea. So I wouldn't be too worried about that at this point, but when you come to that hurdle, it can take some time. 13, negotiate the terms and conditions of the purchase and sign an offer to purchase. And that's a go, no-go decision-making point. Okay, last slide. All right, so these steps are all just managing the process. So you've got the offer to purchase in. You want to make sure the seller's got an asset management plan. They look at their tax implications with a lawyer or a tax accountant, getting the professional advice they need. You develop a knowledge transfer plan because it's not just the money, it's all the knowledge that the seller has that needs to be transferred to the new owners. And then raising the capital, signing up members, and holding the first annual general meeting for the new organization. The co-op or the SPO would assume day-to-day management, and then they need to get support. So they need follow-up and follow-through care around governance education, training for directors and members, what it means to be a cooperative member, what your responsibilities are, etc. And then you want to guide the knowledge transfer to the co-op or the SPO, and the sellers' participation, whether or not they're going to leave or if they're going to continue to support the management of the new organization. So that whole process and that emotional letting go needs to be managed as well. So that's basically my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Russ. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights. Now I will move on to introducing our second presenter, who is Jennifer Williams. For over 20 years, Jennifer has been focused on how business can be an instrument to create a kind, just, and sustainable world. Jennifer worked in microcredit in Northern Ghana with women entrepreneurs in Ottawa, and she was instrumental in the growth of a worker-owned business that pioneered fair trade in Canada. Over the past 9 years, Jennifer has worked as a trusted consultant for ESOP Builders, ESOP, helping companies design and implement employee share ownership plans that suit each company's unique needs and culture. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. If you can move on to my slide deck, that'd be great. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Russ, for the overview. I'm going to take a little step higher. I'm going to assume there are people in this room who are considering transitioning their business to employees, either as a succession plan or as a way to engage employees currently. And so what I'm going to start with is, what are all the different options available? Because there are many options available. And the truth is that even within the options, there are many options. And so I'm going to take a high level view on going over what are the overarching options, so that you can have a sense of like what might fit for your business and what directions you might want to go in. Granted, I have about 15 minutes, so we're going to go quick through that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how those options compare. I'm going to talk a little bit about valuation and a little bit about financing. And so there we go. We're going to run through all of that. If you can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we know is that every business is unique. And I was actually talking to a business owner this morning who said, I asked my accountant, like, how should I set up my business, and my lawyer? And they were like, well, you could do any number of things. And that's true for transitioning your business into a succession plan as well. Russ has already gone through that. If you're thinking of selling your business, you really need to make sure you have a business that's worth selling, that has value and a future. You need to have solid financial systems, bookkeeping, financial statements. And you have to have transferable systems and processes for that next generation of owners. You want to make sure that you have something that you can hand over. We'll go to the next slide. In terms of what do you need for a sale transaction, you need to understand first what you're selling. You could be selling just the assets of the business. You could be selling your customer list. You could be selling the shares of your actual business. And those all have different implications. You need to understand what the value of your business is. And Russ talked a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit further later on. You need legal documents to facilitate any transfer of ownership. And that's if you're transitioning to a co-op, if you're selling shares to your key employees, if you're transitioning to a nonprofit, these things all have legal pieces that you have to do. You need agreement on transition terms, and in particular, how long is the owner going to stay involved, and what is the role of employees in that transition? Go to the next slide. So the first option, if you want to sell your business and you're, let's say you hit 65 and you're like, okay, I'm ready to retire, and you're self-employed. You may be thinking you're going to sell that business to another person or another business. The challenge we have in Canada right now is that we have more businesses for sale than we have buyers. And so unless you have identified a possible buyer, so it could be a strategic partner, it could be a company that you compete with or somebody you work alongside, it could be challenging to find another business or person to sell your company to. And it could take a long time. And so it's an option. You could sell to another person or a business, but it can be a long road. And as Russ said, this is something you want to be planning out 2, 3, 5 years ahead of time. We can go to the next slide. So option 2, you could transition your business to a worker-owned cooperative. And what that means is that the employees of your business become the owners of the business, and they comprise the board of directors, and they would name a manager within that structure. If you can go to the next slide, please. So a few things about a worker co-op, and Russ has gone through a lot on co-ops, so I'm going to keep it really high level. A worker co-op can be a for-profit or a not-for-profit business. It requires a minimum of 3 employees to make it happen. It's democratic and controlled by the cooperative values and principles, and there's a very clear set of co-op values and principles. The shares do not appreciate in value, but profits that are needed for reinvestment are paid, that are not needed for reinvestment are paid out to employee owners. And the way that may look is that on an annual basis, you may say X amount of profit needs to be kept in the business so we can continue to grow and expand and offer new services. And the balance would be paid out to the employee owners as a benefit of being an employee owner of the business. All employees, once they become eligible, and eligibility could be based on time, you have to be employed for 6 months or a year, they become members by buying a membership share in the co-op at a fixed price. The co-op can buy the value of the business from the current shareholders or the current owner at the fair market value. And there are different ways that I have a whole slide on financing. We'll get there at the end. A worker co-op is governed by the Articles of Incorporation, its bylaws, and a governance matrix that defines who would do what. And in some co-op acts, the board must be comprised 80% of employees. So it is a shift. It's quite a shift from a governance perspective. If you're a sole owner of an incorporated business and you have a board of directors that's just you, this is quite a governance shift. So these are one of the things that we look at when we're talking about making these transitions is what would that look like for your organization? We'll go to the next slide, please. Option 3. So third-party sale, maybe you've started that process and it's taking a little long. You look at worker co-op. Option 3, what if I sold the shares of my company to my employees? So an employee share ownership plan is what we would call that. And again, within an employee share ownership plan, there are many different nuances. I'm going to go over some high-level concepts around that. If we'll go to the next slide, please. So employees become owners by buying the shares in the company. There's a philosophical shift, where employees go from being employees to becoming the owner. And as Russ talked about, that takes some time and it takes some work. It's a process. It doesn't happen as soon as you pay for those shares. Shares appreciate in value as the company appreciates in value. Dividends are paid to shareholders from the profits. And the annual fair market value, so it's updated annually, it determines the annual share price for any shares that are being transacted. So if you could have a situation where employees are buying shares every year. So let's say as an owner, you say, okay, I want to retire in 5 years' time. I'm going to sell 20% of the company every year for the next 5 years to my employees. And every year there's a different fair market value based on that, that the share price transacts at. The decision-making is by management and the board of directors, and the shareholder vote is proportionate to the shares that they hold, whereas in a worker co-op, it's a one member, one vote. So that's that democratic principle. Shares are often allocated by years of service, the role in the company, but they could also be equally distributed. And one of the things about an employee share ownership plan as well is that depending on how it's structured, the owner or the employees could use the lifetime capital gains exemption when they sell their shares. In Canada, we have 2 tax-efficient ways well, not tax, but tax kind of avoidant ways to make money. One is through a home that we own. So we don't pay the tax on the increase of the value of our home over the time that we own it, as long as we live in that house. And the same on shares in a Canadian controlled private corporation. So there is a tax advantage there as well. And I believe, and Hazel, maybe you can comment on that, but I believe that shares don't appreciate in a worker co-op. So that's where it doesn't apply within a worker co-op structure. We'll go to the next slide. So some of you have may heard, it's really recent legislation. The Canadian government has recently put into law an employee ownership trust. This is a new legal structure. To be honest, it is not fully formed because we're still waiting for the final pieces of legislation to come out around that, which we're expecting in March. Employee ownership trusts have been very successful in the UK and in the US for facilitating the transition of ownership from owners to employees. If you can go to the next slide, please. Employee ownership trusts are really designed for larger businesses. So we typically between 100 and 500 plus employees. They're designed to really create a true change in ownership. So this is my employees become the owners of the trust in one swoop. This isn't I'm selling gradually to my employees over time. This is an immediate change in ownership to employees. The owners are paid out over time for their value in the company from profits of the business. All employees get to participate unless they already own more than 10% of the company, which you could have an ESOP right now, and then you're trying to figure out how to transition to an EOT. We're still figuring out exactly how that's going to work. As I said, it's a new legislative tool, but it's really designed to help medium-sized businesses transition ownership to their employees and for employees to grow those companies and to own it as a collective of employees. We'll go to the next slide. But then there's also the option 5 of transitioning your business to a social enterprise or a nonprofit. And so within a nonprofit, you could have a registered charity or you could have a not-for-profit corporation. And on a for-profit basis, you could offer a social enterprise where you're a for-profit social enterprise, but that social enterprise has the intention to reinvest in some service or product in the community that has a benefit to the community. If we go to the next slide, please. So it is possible to do a company transition, a for-profit company transition to a not-for-profit society. The society becomes the owner, and the bylaws of that society determine your members, and the members elect the board of directors. The board of directors then hires your executive directors, and the board is the main decision-making body. The idea is that the not-for-profit would buy the assets of the corporation from the fair market value, at the fair market value from the current shareholders. But then, of course, once you are a not-for-profit, profits are not shared with individuals. They need to be used for the purpose of the nonprofit or distributed in accordance with the bylaws, however that's set up. So there you go. You want to sell your business? You've got 5 options, no problem. So how do you decide which one's for you? Because that's a lot of options. So here's some filters. What are the goals and objectives of your business? Is it purpose or profit or both? How do you balance them? What are your transition timelines and how quickly do you want to exit? How do you want to exit all at once? Or you're looking at exiting over time? How much ownership control do you want to have through the transition? With an EOT, for example, you cannot have any ownership control. So you have to be willing to say, I trust my employees to manage this while I get paid out over time. What's the value of the business and how can this transition be financed? So how are you getting your money out and how patient are you to get that money out over time? What's the interest and ability of your team? And so as an example, I had a company I was working with that was super keen to transition to a worker-owned co-op. And we went through a process where I interviewed the entire team and got a take on what that could look like. And then in the end, they were all like, nah, we just want to be employees. We don't want to own this. We want someone to be our boss and to tell us what to do. And so the owner was like, okay, like I can't force them to take on that ownership. And so, the employees really have to be interested in taking on that ownership and leadership in the business. The question on, if you're going to sell to a third party, are you comfortable sharing financial information and sensitive business information with your competitors? Because if you want to sell, you're going to have those conversations. And then the size of your business, you have to be 3 to be a worker-owned co-op. And an employee ownership trust is designed for a mid-sized company of 100 to 500 employees. So this is how you start to filter through some of those options and kind of get to like, okay, well then this one's out and that one's in, and then we can dive a little deeper. We'll go to the next slide. So valuation, how do you value the business? So you've been working on your business 10, 15 years. You're hoping that it's your retirement, a good chunk of your retirement savings. Ultimately, the value of a business is based on an agreement between what the seller is willing to pay and what the seller is willing to sell for and what the buyer is willing to pay. So that said, as Russ mentioned, there are people who are certified business valuators, and what they do is they look at the cash flow of the business, they look at the past performance, they look at the future forecasts, they look at industry comparisons, and they come back and they say, okay, business that's been around for 15 years that has this amount of revenue and this amount of profit, we estimate that your business is worth between this range, 1 and 1.5 million, with a midpoint at $1.25 million. That doesn't mean that's necessarily the number you're going to sell your business at, but that valuation gives you a good sense of where to start. And so whenever I'm talking to companies that are looking at selling their business to their employees, you don't have to have a third-party valuation, but you do have to have a formula or a number that is fair for both the seller and for the employees. It needs to be a fair transaction. We'll go to the next slide. So I hear this every single day in and out. My employees can't afford to buy my company. This is the number one thing that stops people from thinking about transitioning to a worker co-op or transitioning to an employee share ownership. There are lots of different ways that we can facilitate a transition of shares. And I'm going to name them. I'm not going to go into detail on them. But you can do a share freeze, which basically means the seller gets the locked value is paid out over time through a converted share. You can grant shares to employees. Employees can get shares through bonuses over time. You can do payroll deduction. Employee ownership trusts do not require employee investment. And you can use future profits. And I can tell you that I've used all of these different things with different clients based on their realities and the values of the companies. I'm going to leave it at that. That was a super quick, high-level overview of a lot of complicated things. I will be available for questions at the end of this, so note them down and happy to take them then.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. That was amazing. Really do appreciate you sharing your input with us today. All right, I will now move on to introducing our third speaker. Before that, I just want to remind everyone that if you have not yet filled out the 2 Zoom poll questions, again, they just help us get a better feel of who's in the room and how well we're serving our target groups. So if you could take some time to fill that out, I will reshare that link in the chat right now, so it's up again. All right, presenter number 3. Juliette Kego Ume Onido is a financial advisor with one of the leading financial institutions in Canada. She is also a social justice advocate, an international speaker poet, and a master certified leadership coach trainer. A passionate advocate of financial resilience and economic opportunities for women and youth, she is an active proponent of the cooperative movement and the solidarity economy. Juliette is a co-founder of Whole Woman Network, a leadership, advocacy, and empowerment social enterprise for BIPOC women and youth. Welcome, Juliette. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Unmute myself. Can everyone hear me okay? Danielle, next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm basically going to be talking about our journey as both a social enterprise and a worker cooperative, how we started and how that journey has evolved. Next slide. So basically a little bit about Whole Woman Network and then the whole conversion process, why the conversion and what that entailed, who was involved, and the how. I know Ross had talked a lot about that. I'm just going to give our own, from our own point of view. And then I'll talk about the challenges and the opportunities in having this transition of converting from an informal collective to a social purpose organizations, and then why social purpose organizations, specifically even cooperatives, are really relevant to all equity denied groups. Next slide. So basically in 2010, myself and another friend of mine, Diana, we got together and we started an informal collective, Whole Woman Network. And pretty soon, we had more women join us. And basically, when we started, the goal was really to help one another. And we soon started offering financial literacy programs because some of the women that were reaching out to us needed help. There were some were in abusive relationships, so we needed to pool funds together to help them access the resources that they needed. And we used a model that's very Afrocentric called ROSCA, the Rotating Savings and Credit Association. Next slide. And so a little bit more about this model upon which, whole enterprises, they're based. So the ROSCA is an informal financial cooperative, basically a group of people, typically women, come together and then they contribute monies at interval, and then that rotates among the group. So basically like an informal peer-to-peer lending, credit, banking system. However, we iterated this model to go beyond just financial. So in terms of skills, in terms of pulling resources together, in terms of working together. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. And so one thing that's really key to us is that the ROSCA model we found among different immigrant communities in Canada, that there was that commonality. So it was kind of like a common language, to reach out to people, to create synergies and to get people together to work on issues. And so in this whole journey of us being an informal entity and then transitioning, the fact that we had something that was common to all made it easier. So for instance, talking about cooperatives, not a lot of people really understand what the cooperative model is as a model, as a business model. But when we use the ROSCA as an example to say, oh, this is actually an informal cooperative, it opened up the conversation, right? People could identify with that, and then we built on that. Next slide. And this is basically like a snapshot of the community, where, right now, in terms of those that are participating, members that participate in ROSCAs, where as of today, we're 161 people, but originally Whole Woman was started by 2 people, Diana and myself, and then we invited other women. And I'll go into in the next couple of slides how we were able to kind of decide, okay, which route do we go from an informal entity, why the consideration for a social enterprise, why for a cooperative? But I guess we reach pretty much everyone. So it's not limited to any one group, even though the primary focus is on BIPOC, women and youth. And right now we're out of 2 provinces that we have strong membership in, here in Ontario, and then we have a growing membership in the Francophone speaking part, like in Quebec. So that's something that we're excited about. Next slide. So this idea of business conversion, why? I think Ross gave a really great high level, overview of why consider like a social purpose organization, especially a cooperative, right? The democratic model, the fact that you have agency, you're sharing risk, people, come together and are working based on the cooperative principles and values, right? So there's so many reasons. And from a business standpoint, the idea that co-ops, the chances of survival is actually, it's greater than the traditional businesses. So for us, as an informal entity, we struggled a lot. So for anyone who's listening, and and I know we have in the BIPOC community, lots of informal organizations, groups, or enterprises, right? For one reason or the other, didn't formalize their structure. Sometimes it's due to lack of capital. Sometimes it's just not understanding the process and not having people to walk you through that process. And if you're listening, I just want to say that the whole project around JEDDI business conversion that CWCF, is really spearheading, is really to give access to resources if you were considering, converting. So be sure to look out for those resources. And that's really what we did. Through another cooperative that I'm involved with, we were able to access resources in terms of understanding the cooperative model, why this model is feasible, right? And to be able to look at it and say, does this work for us, or will this work for us? And what we finally came to was that there was a need for us to have a for-profit element, the social enterprise, just because there were two or so people that were not willing, to let go of that model and shift everything to the cooperative model, because the cooperative, the Worker Co-op Whole Women Network, the need that we saw in the community, which is really around lack of financial literacy, lack of access to capital, things like that, I think that our mandate is to do that at a large scale, to reach a lot of people. And we realize that a cooperative will be the perfect model for that, because it involved, again, being able to train a lot of other coaches and advisors to do the work of financial literacy, to do the work of teaching, women business owners, youth business owners, how to access capital, how to understand the cooperative sector. And so it was important for us to, in our assessment, we really looked at it to say, okay, for this to be viable, the social enterprise, which houses a lot of the certification trainings that we do on a B2B level, right? There was a need to create that so that there's sustainability across board, right? You're not just focused on, we want to change our community. We want to, give people access to resources, to trainings, without doing that in a sustainable way. Next slide. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Like I said, the poor financial literacy culture, especially BIPOC community, and the data points are kind of like everywhere, right? And these are like just a few snapshots that we got. Really important to see number 2, in terms of immigrants having a high level of poverty in Canada. And since the pandemic, that has even gotten worse. And with women entrepreneurs, we're not even getting up to 1%. Black women entrepreneurs, Indigenous women entrepreneurs, 1% of the funding that's available. And so these are some of the things that we thought, okay, how do we, use both the social enterprise model and the cooperative model, right, to create access and build it upon this ROSCA model that a lot of people in these communities are very familiar with. How do they use, self-agency to do that? Okay, just making sure I'm good for time. In terms of the work that we're trying to do, it's really important to understand that when we talk of lack of access to capital, for instance, next slide, when we talk of access to capital, for instance, it's not just that people are not able to, say, access loans or something. Sometimes the interest rate that they get it, and we're in a high interest rate environment, makes it like a business killer, right? For a lot of these businesses, most of these businesses are not even small or, you know, medium or micro. They are nano businesses. And so the need for culturally informed types of funding is really important, and these are part of the solutions that we're creating. And of course, one of the key things around moving from silos to solidarity is that there's a lot of, we see the uptick in mental health crisis among our target demographic, especially with the youth. So creating these opportunities where they learn early around financial literacy, they're able to come together, even culturally informed leadership models, the cooperative model allows for that social isolation, right? To address the issue of social isolation. Next slide. And in terms of the challenges and opportunities, we've talked about lack of access to capital. And I think the point I also want to raise there is that it's not just access to cash capital, it's also access to social capital, right? So you find that due to, like, for immigrants, for instance, or even indigenous populations, due to the fact that historically, right, there's the marginalization that indigenous people have faced, you know, and be it whether it's racism and other, you know, factors, you know, of inequality, you find that people do not have access to the social capitals that would even allow them then be able to access capital, right? So the idea of a cooperative is building organically, even though there's systemic issue, right? But you can build organically around community. So for BIPOC populations, for instance, for us, it was really important to look at this lack of access to capital from a different lens of agency, which is really what the cooperative model is about, of saying, you know what, you can have a democratic model where everyone has a say. There's self-determination. There's, you know, one vote to one person. There's the idea of education, of constantly learning together, peer learning, and the cooperation among different cooperatives. So all these principles allows for us to build organically and then be able to support one another and leverage those resources to then access funding from the system. And as you're doing that, you're then building your own social capital. In terms of capacity, I think the challenge, one of the biggest challenges for us in this process of conversion from informal to an SPO, social purpose organization, is that it's a distinct model, especially the cooperative model, right? It's not the way that you do traditional business. That you do it. In fact, if your sole purpose is just to make money, maybe the cooperative model is not for you, because the social element, you have to learn a lot about what this means, right? I know Ross talked about it, that triple bottom line approach. So for us, we even add purpose to it. So you're looking at purpose, you're looking at, you know, people, very people-centric. You're looking at not just profit, but shared prosperity, right? Because that's really what the cooperative model is about. And of course, the planet, all those environmental factors. And so in terms of capacity, there's the gap that we still currently face, right? Even though we're overcoming it gradually, of getting the training that we need from all the different stakeholders. But for anyone who's looking to convert, that's something that you really have to pay attention to, the learning, immersing yourself in this cooperative sector, understanding how it is structured, understanding how you know, like just how everything is run, how you build your systems and stuff. The cooperative gap that I put there is about the lack of awareness with the general population around co-op. So that shows up in maybe you're going for funding, your banker doesn't even understand what a co-op model is. We had that challenge. They were thinking it was just this loose association, right? Not really a business entity. So that gap is also something that you have to be aware of, just so that you know that there's a lot of education, both internally and externally, that happens. Then codifying the principles and the values. One of the distinct thing about, you know, cooperative are those 7 principles and the values, accompanying values. So the fact that, you know, they exist really means not until they are operationalized. So for us, it's this constant struggle of how do we operationalize these principles and values, right? How do you get those things into your systems? Like Jennifer had talked about, you know, if you want to convert from a business to, you know, to an SPO or any other model, you have to have systems in place that you can transfer over, right? So how do you begin to build that? And for us, coming from the point of view of being an informal collective, where we really didn't have systems, we didn't like have like the valuation of, you know, what that business, because we didn't really look at it as a business. So that challenge, right, of being able to now begin to build systems and structures and processes in a way that allows for sustainability. And in terms of opportunities, just, you know, funding resources, when you're doing this conversion, to think beyond just the co-op space or the credit unions, because sometimes the credit unions, they are so risk averse, they might not even be the right fit for you, even though they are cooperatives. So really to have a bankable entity, make sure that your social purpose organization is bankable, so that you can access funding from all sources, right? Like your books, your financials, all of that. I really want to talk about the Co-op Academy. And how am I doing for time? I just want to make sure.
We're good on time, Juliet. It's 2 p.m. now, and if we go to 2:10, we're still good.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about the CWCF Co-op Academy, because for me, it was really something that shifted a lot of things and is kind of like a core contributor to how I'm approaching with the rest of our team, the work that we're doing now, right? Both as a social enterprise and as a worker co-op. We had gotten into this program and we're lucky. Ross is here. He was our coach through a different cooperative that I'm a part of, BWP Co-op. And the learning here, I think one of the key learnings, right? There are so many, but one of the key learning is really around the financials. And I just feel this is something that for a lot of organizations, whether you're a business or an informal entity and you're converting to a co-op, sometimes I think maybe even in the BIPOC community, we don't pay enough attention to our financials, right? So yes, there's lack of access to capital, but are we also doing the work of making sure that we have bankable entities, of making sure that all our numbers, all our ratios, everything that should be in place is in place? And are we also getting access to, you know, the right support system to help with that, whether it's your bookkeeper, your accountant, your lawyer, like all of that, and putting it in place. So from the CWCF Academy, one key learning that we translated into our model, right, as a cooperative and as a social enterprise, is that we took our time to do a proper feasibility study, to understand our target market, right? Understand what their pain points are, what their purchasing power is. And that's really important in an environment where you're serving marginalized or underserved, underrepresented groups, right? So that you're not creating solutions that people are not able to afford, or you don't have a pathway for them to access funding to then be able to pay for those services. And what that allowed us to do was take our time to really build out a business plan that's very realistic, and that's ongoing. Like we're constantly, improving on it and checking and making sure the numbers are aligning. And so far, that level of sustainability and it gives confidence to the team to know that we're on the right track. So I really want to thank, the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation for that opportunity, because it's made a world of a difference. And the overall co-op ecosystem, whether it's the Ontario Co-op Association, all the co-op developers that we've worked with, the opportunities in the social purpose organization, specifically in the co-op sector, is such that you have support. And maybe that's why the success rate, the rate of compared to traditional businesses, maybe that's why it's higher, because you do have a support system, and you're learning how to work as a team. You're not working in silos. It takes a longer time, right? But I think the outcomes are worth it. And I want to touch briefly on the CLIP program. This is the Center for Local Innovation and Collaboration through the city of Richmond Hill. We were accepted into that program. And what it is really being able to take what you're doing, partner you with higher institutions. So we're working with 2 post-secondary institutions now, where they're looking at your whole model, making sure it's bankable, making sure you're getting access to the support and the resources that you need. And this is important to us because as a cooperative, typically people think, if you're running a cooperative, it's difficult to get support outside of the sector. But I think once you build a business plan that shows, what you're trying to do, what the impact is, even to the local economy, you just open up yourself to a lot of resources. Next slide. And why is this relevant to equity denied groups? I'm going to touch on this really quickly. And if anyone wants to have a follow-up conversation, because this can be like an hour-long presentation, this for me is the crux of it. Having gone through this process and even going through it, right? It's important for all equity denied groups to really look at the co-op model, to really look at social purpose organizations, right? And see where the gaps are. So for instance, if we look at it historically, right? The affinities there. You look at the work of Jessica Gordon Nemhan, it captures that whole history of the cooperative sector from the US lens. We don't have such a study for Canada, and I'm hoping that eventually we'll be able to, build some synergy with some other organizations and attract some funding to have an actual study, the historical context, so that people understand that this has always been there. As a result of racism, slavery, and all these, these parts of history that really disproportionately affected, equity denied groups. What has happened is that on the ground, they built cooperatives. They worked cooperatively, right? So it's now, how do we take this history, bring it to the present, and begin to build entities that serve the needs, the very many needs that our communities have? The cultural context, we talked about Roska. In my culture, it's called Esusu. In the Caribbean culture, it's called Susu. In Kenya, Chama, in different cultures, there's a variation of it, there's a name for it. That is an informal cooperative. So it's something that we've always done, right? The whole Ubuntu philosophy, which is very Afrocentric. And if you look at even with indigenous communities, leave no one behind, is a huge connector, right? The idea that, we're nothing unless we're all doing well. that idea is really the co-op headspace, that headspace of shared prosperity, of making sure everyone has agency, has a voice, of making sure that you're not just, serving capital like the capitalist model. Rather, you're serving the community. You're bringing everyone along and making sure that people are thriving. The socioeconomic dimension, why is this important? I think even since COVID, even more so. For equity denied groups, if you look at issues around gentrification, where we see entire communities kind of like being raised down or moved for, modern structures to come up. The businesses that are, affected, a lot of businesses are owned by one person or maybe a family, and then there's nothing around succession that's being built. A lot of times, no systems and structures in place. So the cooperative model offers us an opportunity to build collectively. It offers us an opportunity to share learning, right? And there's the intersectional and international lens that I want us to look at also. Intersectional in terms of whether it's gender, whether it's age, whether it's, based on orientation, disability. There are so many intersectionalities that when you look at, you look at that vis-a-vis the cooperative model, you see where the affinities are, right? For women, traditionally all across Africa, and you find that in immigrant communities across the world, particularly even in Canada, a lot of them are very familiar with the cooperative model. It's how they've always worked, it's how they've lived, it's how they've done life. So when you look at issues now around childcare, the cost of childcare in Canada, the issue around remote work, being able to just not have that transition of where people are now required, especially women, to go back, fully, and then there's you balance that with the cost of childcare. You look at issues around gender-based violence, harassment in workplaces, even issues around pay gap equity. The cooperative model, for some of our members, those were the drivers. It was like, you know what, I'm done with being in a space that maybe there's racism, there's aggression, macro or micro. I can't keep up with cost of daycare. And it was like, how do we create a space, a worker cooperative that really defines the future of work that we want, right? Where rest and health, mental health is prioritized, where you're compensated fairly, living wages. So these are issues that we should think about for all equity denied groups. The international lens that I want us to look at is that because the cooperative model is so entrenched in a lot of immigrant communities, whether it's Latin America, Africa, Asia, it doesn't matter. It's something that, it's a part of life there. Sometimes when equity denied groups that live in Canada, when the vision is very narrow, when we're looking at just the Canadian sector, it's very easy to feel like a minority and feel like you're on the outside, right, of the cooperative sector. But if we open up our lens and say, wait a minute, there's a bigger movement, right? The cooperative sector is much bigger. What can we bring in from the different cultures, the different places, the different communities, and show this to the Canadian sector so that there's an opening that happens? And so really happy about the work that CWCF and so many other organizations are doing in this space, because they're allowing for that opening to happen. They're allowing for equity denied group to say, wait a minute, I belong here. There's something in this space for me. And I just quickly want to run through some examples internationally of women, especially women co-op, that are doing excellent work. In India, a group of women came together. They couldn't get access to capital. Rural farmers, the bank said they were illiterate. These women came together, started doing the susu. and decided to open their own bank. Right now, they have a membership over 200,000 and capitalization 20 million. That's the power of cooperatives. In South Africa, a 33-year-old lady, Nthabelang Lokotsi, recently just created the first cooperative bank. She started as a co-op. They were doing Roscas. In South Africa, it's called Stokvel, right? And they were putting their 1,000 Rand a month, putting it together. Why were they doing this? Because they were shut out from the traditional banking systems, right? These are women in the informal space, people with nano businesses, people that you can find examples of them here in Canada. So the point is, they were able to pull all the resources together because she went for an event in Switzerland. I was exposed to the cooperative model. And she said, wait a minute, that's what we've been doing, right? But informally. And so she was able to now build the structures, put the systems, like Ross and Jennifer had talked about, put all those processes in place, understood the model, what the law says, how to have your bylaws, all of that, attracted investors. And now they have a cooperative bank that's serving equity denied, groups in their country. So it's the possibility of what can be. So for anyone who feels, I'm a part of the equity denied group, marginalized in some way, underrepresented, have no access to capital to grow, face racism and different types of isms, classism and all of that. Know that perhaps this is a model worth exploring. It doesn't mean that at the end of that exploration, you're definitely going to convert to a social purpose organization or become a cooperative, but it is worth looking at, and it is worth looking at collectively. Next slide. And this is just kind of like an overview of the traction and testament of how far we've come with the cooperative model. When we were working informally, we're just doing stuff, right? Working in community, different intervention, but there was no structure around it. There wasn't really sustainability built in. Right now, with the learnings, whether it's from the Co-op Academy, from working with Co-op developers and coaches, there's just, even we recognize the growth, right? There's that confidence and the possibility of learning, of learning more and more. And so in terms of client base, we're growing, we're raising capital. We have the number of people that are actively using our digital rosters are growing daily. We're able to teach other informal groups how to incorporate what they're doing into a formal cooperative. Partners and stakeholders, even though we're cooperative, we've partnered with a fintech platform to use their app. And they've also been able to partner with Equifax. So when people save and learn about financial literacy through our programs, they're able to build up their credit. So for us, that's a significant milestone, and we hope to be able to share this with a lot of post-secondary institutions through the CLICK program, and with Paro Women's Enterprise, the Center for Women's Enterprise, based in Thunder Bay. What they've been able to do is show us how you can create lending circles and get access to micro loans and grants, and gradually show women how to build up their credit, how to build up their confidence, how to create financial plans, and then from there to scale their enterprises. And so overall, I think by and large, if I were to give kind of like an assessment of how the journey of conversion has been for us, it really has been positive. There's been a lot of challenges, new learnings that we had to go through and that we're still going through. But we know that we have the support, right? Whether it's from the Federation, different co-op associations, coaches, mentors, advisors like Ross. There's just an ecosystem that's there to support the work that you're doing. So I'm really going to be wrapping up. Our next slide is just a testimonial from one of our members, Bilkisu Umar. And she's kind of like an example of the sort of women you would find in our community, right? She's a Muslim, young, of Nigerian descent, came to Canada, very well educated, master's level, and yet in starting her business in the food space, there were so many challenges that she faced. And as a community, as a cooperative, we're all working together to make sure that she grows and all of us also grow with our different endeavors. And it's really been remarkable. So, and this is really the end of my presentation. Just the final shout out to the Banker Ladies Council. That's the final slide. You can, yeah. So they're doing all the work around the advocacy, around, awareness of saying we can bridge the formal and the informal and create something bigger. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. That was amazing. Every time I listened to you, I learned something new. So really enjoyed that. And thank you so much to our other two speakers. You all did a wonderful job. And now we're going to move into our question and answer session. And so we did have a question already submitted by someone. And so I'll read it out. And I think Jennifer and Russ had agreed to tackle this question. So I'll read it to the audience, and everyone else feel free to put your hand up or send your questions in the chat. And if Kay and Hazel could help me monitor the chat, that would be amazing. First question, what are the true benefits and drawbacks of converting to a workers' cooperative as a team of 3 compared to something like employee stock ownership plan? We want to become a cooperative philosophically, but it feels a lot more daunting of a task to change my organization structure compared to offering ownership within the same structure while following the co-op principles. Jennifer, if you want to take the first stab at it.
Sure, I can do that. I would say if you're philosophically aligned with the co-op principles and you intend to implement those anyway, then it's actually not such a big transition, because it's from a CRA perspective, from a business incorporation perspective, there's a rollover mechanism that allows you to do that. And so I would say, if all the other things align, don't let the structure determine how you're going to move forward. I would say follow what feels right for your organization and then sort out the details to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would just reinforce that. I think it's a cooperative is a conscious decision, like people have to want to do it. So if your values and your principles, the cooperative principles align with your organization and with the individuals in it, like there's goal congruence there, then it just makes so much sense. I think one of the things Juliet said that was so important was around the survival of cooperative businesses compared to regular businesses and the support through the co-op ecosystem. Like I've been working in this sector for 40 years, and actually Marty Frost is on this call. He was one of the first mentors that I had, and in food co-ops. And cooperatives just share information and knowledge and help each other. And you don't get that in a regular business. So I think, that is one of the cooperative values, is cooperation amongst cooperatives. So I think our economy, which is hyper competitive and kind of individualistic, that's also a barrier for people because they're not used to cooperating. They're not trusting. They're not used to sharing information. So I think, it's an advantage if you're well aligned, but it can also be a disadvantage, like Julia mentioned, when you're talking to, mainstream institutions. They may have no knowledge whatsoever of cooperatives and don't understand it. Like often they'll ask something like, well, who's the boss there? Well, we don't just have a boss. Like it's a collective. It's a group of people that are making the decisions. So it's an ongoing education process, both internally and externally.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Russ, for those amazing responses. I hope that answered the question. Anyone else have any questions or comments? I'm not able to see everyone at the same time, so feel free to just nudge me in the chat if you have your hand up and I'm not seeing you. But in the meanwhile, I have a question. Juliet, you mentioned about sort of gentrification, a lot of these things happening in marginalized communities. And I'm just thinking of how can we use sort of the co-op model and social purpose organizations as a means to sort of mitigate those challenges that we face of displacement. And we see that happening a lot amongst BIPOC communities as well. When urban renewal happens, especially in downtown cores. And so I'm curious as to maybe how we can implement cooperatives and raise awareness of social purpose organizations to help us deal with those challenges.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks Janelle, for that question. I think it's what we're part of the solution is what we're doing now, right? Webinars like this, and spreading more awareness, right? I think a lot of times there's this saying, Alice Walker, that people don't know how much power they have, right? And because you don't know how much power you have, you're not aware of how to exercise that power. So until we start having more and more in-depth conversation, and not just at this level, but even in our educational systems, I think it's really important to start early in our communities to expose youth, even teenagers, right, to the co-op model. Because the way the world is now, the younger generations are more in tune, right, with sustainability, with making sure they share prosperity, with humanity, all of that. They are so aware, but a lot of them are not aware of the co-op model, right? So if we're to see those changes in our community, it's to start early, not just the top down, but to a bottom up, to have those conversations so that in our policies, in how we do business, even in how we work collectively, we can create that change, right? A lot of the businesses in these areas that are facing gentrification, they are working in silos. Imagine if some of those businesses that are in similar market, like they come together, instead of working in silos, let's become a cooperative, right? And you're stronger, you're more sustainable, then you can advocate, self-advocacy, even with the government, to say, no, this is what we want. It shouldn't be this way. This is why we should have, X, Y, Z. Thank you.
I just wanted to reinforce what Juliet's saying, because from my experience, as an individual, you want to make some changes even in your own community, your own neighborhood. But if you organize other people together with you, you're going to have way more power. So that's the experience of unions, labor unions. That's the experience of cooperatives. That's the experience of associations, political parties. I mean, you need to organize collectively. You need to get people on the same page, share the values and the vision, and move forward with that. And that's how change happens.
Thank you both for those amazing responses. Thank you so much. And we have another question in the chat. So this is kind of a two-part question. Can shares for a cooperative from a business privately owned by me be sold below market value? So like $50 instead of via an evaluation. And can that same share be repurchased if the employee leaves for the same amount? Or would it be sold at fair market value? I'd like to offer ownership while an employee is part of our organization without having it be inaccessible with a high cost, for example, $50,000. So I'm going to reread the first part of that question, which is, can shares for a cooperative from a business privately owned by me be sold below market value? That's part one. Anyone would like to?
I can answer that, which is that CRA will not allow you to sell shares at less than fair market value. There are rules around that, and if you were ever audited or your employee was ever audited, there could be repercussions for that. So I would never advise just choosing a nominal value. That said, there are ways around that. You could structure, you could look at how you structure that to make it affordable for your employee. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, it is really important to understand, what the tax rules are, and CRA, they want to make sure there's an arm's length transaction, and that, they don't want people avoiding taxation. So that's their motivation. So, yeah, you have to be careful around that, and it's good to get some expert advice from a lawyer or a tax accountant about that. In the end, the business assets will be transferred based on what people feel is fair, and it's got to approach the fair market value. Otherwise, CRA is going to come after you.
Thank you both for those responses. Thank you so much. And we'll just move on to our next slide, which is just the contact info for the presenters and the CWCF JEDDI Business Conversion team. And so I know this was only an hour and a half, and we have to wrap up in about 3 minutes. However, the contact information for all the presenters are here. Please feel free to send them an email or call them with your questions, comments, and queries. As well, at this time, I'm going to ask Hazel if you could please post a link to the second set of Zoom poll questions in the chat. So if everyone could take just a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, to fill out those questions to help us assess how well this webinar was perceived today, what we could improve on, that would be great as well. And here is a slide with a lot of the resources and communication materials that we have developed so far throughout the JEDDI Business Conversion Project. This webinar is a part of that project. And I would just like to point out 2 of the last links down below. So our service provider directory is essentially a list of individuals that are experts within the cooperative and social purpose organization space, such as co-op developers, lawyers, accountants, and they can assist individuals who are converting a business from a traditional model to a cooperative model, or who are just developing a social enterprise or a co-op from the ground up. As well, we've also created a question and answer form where individuals who are interested in co-op conversions or actually in the process of doing so can submit questions and receive an answer from our team within 72 hours. So please feel free to utilize those resources and share with individuals you think may need them. And I wanted to say a huge thank you. We had a great turnout today, so that's definitely thrilling to see. I'm seeing some new faces as well as familiar ones. So hi, and I'm really happy to see you guys here today. And thank you so much for your continued support of the JEDDI Business Conversion Project and of the CWCF. Before we go, I'm just going to check in the, oh, we have a quick question in the chat. Which financial institution can you propose for a group that's informally organized and setting up? Does any of the speakers like to take a quick stab at that?
I just replied in the chat to try a credit union. So like Meridian, for example, or some of the other credit unions, depending on where you're located.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and I would say that, sometimes credit unions, depending on their size, are even more conservative in terms of dealing with small businesses, or especially startups. They don't want to take any risk. So, find a financial institution and an individual person or manager that will also, work with you. And they do have a lot less discretion than they used to, because there used to be character lending, but it's all financial ratios done at the head offices now. So you really have to have, like Juliet said in her presentation, you really have to have your financials together to make it work. It's very important. And that's what the financial institutions are going to look at for the most part.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone who participated. Thank you so much for being here. And I see some people asking in the chat, yes, we will be sending around the recording and the slideshow to everyone that's registered. And we will be posting the recording on our website. So we'll advise when that's complete. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Janelle. Thanks, presenters. It was great.
Thank you. Hi, Hazel.
That was amazing. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.